Love is the willing of the good of the other as other. That's a Thomas formula, by the way. Really helpful. Love is not a feeling. Feelings come and go. Love is an act of the will. To will the good of the other as other. Not, I'm willing your good because you'll do something nice to me. That's willing my good through you. But to will the good of the other as other. You see, but God is the only one that can do that in the utterly perfect way, because God has no self-interest. Since God has no ontological need, any and all of his actions ad extra are for the good of the other. Therefore, the world has been spoken into being non-violently and lovingly. In response to certain Hegelianizing tendencies in the theology of the 19th century, the First Vatican Council reiterated this point, stating that God creates not out of any sort of need, but out of a desire to share his goodness. In most of the mythologies of the ancient world, creation takes place through some primordial act of violence. God or the gods wrestling some enemy or opponent into submission. The philosophical accounts of Plato and Aristotle represent a more sophisticated version of this myth in the measure that they picture a divine figure, the demiurgos in Plato, the prime mover in Aristotle, shaping matter into form. See, but there's none of that in the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo. God cannot even in principle wrestle some alien and recalcitrant opponent into submission or shape from the outside in an intervening way, some substance that stands opposed to him. Rather, he brings the whole of finite reality into being non-violently. And the biblical narrative here is quite telling, because God doesn't fight the world into being, as did almost any other ancient myth. Rather, he speaks the world into being. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, etc. Another question that can be explored under the rubric of the divine creativity is this: why precisely does God create at all? If, as Thomas insists, God in his perfection is utterly self-sufficient, why would God feel obligated to give rise to finite being? One way classically to solve this problem is to dissolve it and say that God creates because he has to. The medieval Arabic philosopher Avicenna, for example, argued that creation is a kind of automatic emanation from God. In saying this, he anticipated by 8 centuries or so the dialectical theology of Hegel, and by 9 centuries the process theology of Whitehead and his disciples. But with this sort of emanationism, Aquinas has no truck. While natural causes that act through necessity are determined toward the production of one kind of effect, think of a plant that gives rise predictably to seed after seed, causes that act through intelligence and will produce a wide variety of effects. Think here of Picasso or James Joyce. God's production, obviously, is wild in its fecundity and diversity, and thus it follows for Thomas that God's mode of creativity is not automatic, but intelligent, purposive, and artistic. Thus, God chooses with artistic intent to give rise to the universe, but he does so in utter freedom from self-interest. And this implies necessarily that God's creative act is a gesture of love. For love is the willing of the good of the other as other.